We come today to Exodus chapter 23, verses 1 to 13. Before the final ritual laws were given to Israel, which conclude the present law code in verses 23 and 10 to 19, several final principles of conduct were revealed by the Lord in verses 1 to 9. The first group, in verses 1 to 3, gave more detail to the law of chapter 20, verse 16. 5 prohibitions were given with respect to the conduct of witnesses in a court of law. False testimony was forbidden, as was conspiracy to tell lies. Witnesses were to resist the pressure to side with the majority or give a testimony which the majority wanted to hear. Personal prejudice, especially against the poor, was forbidden. These temptations are often difficult to resist today, and though we may not be called as witnesses in a court of law, our whole lives are to be governed by the same principles. We're to be disciplined in our speech, as we note in James chapter 3, verses 1 to 12. And our example is to be the Lord Jesus, as Peter points out in 1 Peter 2, verse 22. Jesus' life and his words were always full of grace and truth, as John reminds us in his Gospel in chapter 1, verse 14. They always brought life and reconciliation. We cannot set ourselves a lower standard than him. Verses 4 and 5 reminded the Israelites that they were to show caring compassion even for an enemy. The Lord Jesus taught the same truth in Matthew chapter 5, verse 43 to 48. And in his own concern for the needs of sinners, showed the standard which is to be copied by us. The final verses in this little section, verses 6 to 9, record the rules God gave to judges. They were to avoid bias, were to examine the evidence carefully so as to avoid conviction on false charges. They were to assume the best about a person unless the evidence was conclusive against them. They were not to be influenced by anything other than the truth. These words form the basis of all true justice. However, they don't just apply to judges. All too often Christians are ready to share gossip and to condemn others on the basis of it without any serious attempt given to arrive at the truth. Not infrequently, prejudice makes a believer automatically think the worst of some people. Too often people are not treated as individuals but are condemned because they're members of a certain group and are judged without evidence. If unbelievers act in such a way, it's no excuse for believers who copy them. God forbids such conduct. He calls us to peace. The laws ended as they began, with laws given to regulate the religious life of the people, as we see in verses 10 to 19. This was significant, for it emphasized the Lord's sovereignty over all that the people did. These laws can be divided into 2 groups. The first provides legislation for the Sabbath in verses 10 to 13, and the second was especially devoted to laws for the 3 annual festivals in verses 14 to 19. The Sabbath day had already been mentioned by the Lord in chapter 20, verse 8, and here the principle of a Sabbath day was extended to Sabbath years, which would have had the same symbolic purpose as the day. However, a new reason for the Sabbath legislation was added by the Lord. The laws were intended to ensure that the poor in society would not starve, and that the whole of life be subject to a cycle of work and relaxation. These principles are no less applicable today. They remind us to pattern our lives in a proper way and remind governments of their responsibility to ensure their employees are not exploited by their employers in such a way as to deny them a proper rhythm of life. Once again, it's notable that the Lord showed such concern for those in danger of being exploited. We should not miss this emphasis in the law, and should once again consider the application to our own lives and our own situations.